Who was Jack the Ripper, really? Welcome to Collapse, where history comes to life and each video takes you into the destiny of those who shaped the world. Today, prepare to dive into the thick mists of Victorian London, between dark alleys, flickering streetlights, and whispers of fear in the night air. At the heart of the wretched district of Whitechapel, a name emerges, chilling, elusive: Jack the Ripper. Faceless killer, shadow among shadows, he spread terror in just a few weeks and etched his myth into the fabric of history. Enigmatic letters, macabre crime scenes, an endless investigation, and always this silence. No name, no trial, no culprit. But behind the monster, one question remains. Who was really Jack the Ripper? A solitary criminal, an agent of power, a myth born from collective fear? But before embarking on a new adventure, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to not miss anything. Thank you, and enjoy the journey. Around 1880, the planet was at a historical crossroads where technological changes, imperial conquests, and vast migratory movements intersected. On all continents, daily life was accelerating, disrupted by new inventions, the formation of rival political blocs, and instabilities related to social inequalities. The steam engine and the telegraph had already transformed commerce and communications, but a new industrial revolution, driven by steel, the telephone, and electricity, was underway. Never before had so many humans moved and connected, thanks to advances like transoceanic cables and international rail networks. The second industrial revolution, associated with the massive production of steel thanks to the Bessemer process, revolutionized shipbuilding and railways, as well as urban development with the advent of skyscrapers. The invention of the telephone in 1876 opened up new perspectives, while electricity revolutionized lighting, transport, and industry. From Berlin to New York, major capitals competed in modernity, multiplying world expos. Advances in chemistry and metallurgy also transformed agriculture through the use of chemical fertilizers and efficient machinery. This frenzy of innovations took place in a world dominated by colonial empires, especially those of the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, unified since 1871 under Bismarck. The British dominated a vast empire thanks to their navy and a commercial network stretching from India to Canada and southern Africa. France strengthened its influence in North Africa and Southeast Asia, while Germany sought to catch up to assert itself among the great powers. Commercial and diplomatic competition was accompanied by a race for raw materials essential to industrial development. These imperial rivalries fueled tensions threatening European stability and influencing global relations. Colonial powers multiplied treaties and secret agreements, fostering distrust. Meanwhile, the Russian Empire extended its influence in Central Asia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire maintained a fragile dominance in southeastern Europe. The United States, having emerged from the Civil War in 1865, turned westward and toward the Pacific, strengthening its interest in trans-Pacific trade and overseas expansion. Each empire sought to secure its position, even if it meant crossing the red line at borders. Meanwhile, massive migrations reshaped the demographic map of several continents. Jews fled persecutions in Eastern Europe towards Great Britain, France, or the United States. The Irish, struck by the 19th century Great Famine, emigrated by the hundreds of thousands in search of work and land. On the west coast of the United States, a significant influx of Chinese workers, initially recruited for the railroads, settled in cities like San Francisco. In South America, Italians and Spaniards were drawn by intensive agriculture and maritime trade. These migrations resulted from economic crises, political upheavals, famines, and discrimination. They were encouraged by maritime companies offering reduced fare tickets. The elites of host countries saw them as a cheap labor force, while local populations feared job competition. In ports like Liverpool, London, or Hamburg, the docks became cosmopolitan crossroads where merchants, workers, and refugees mingled, creating an unprecedented cultural ferment. Despite these exchanges, the end of the 19th century remains marked by violent tensions. In the colonies, subjected peoples resist through revolts, or by valuing their cultural identities. In Europe, nationalisms awaken in Bohemia, Poland, or Hungary, demanding more autonomy from the empires. Meanwhile, socialist parties and unions challenge the relationships between employers and workers, leading to the first general strikes relayed by the press. Trade and diplomatic exchanges become more complex, and conflicts loom. Around 1880, the Spanish-American War has not yet been triggered, but tensions around Cuba and the Philippines are intensifying. The United States, influenced by the Monroe Doctrine, seeks to control the American continent, while Spain fears losing its overseas colonies, vital for its prestige and economy. The press and public opinion stoke these tensions. Simultaneously, the Berlin Conference on Africa, 1884 to 1885, convened by Bismarck, defines the rules for the partition of the continent. Western powers draw arbitrary boundaries without considering ethnic or cultural realities. Italy, Belgium, and Portugal participate in this division, paving the way for systematic colonization, exploiting mineral, agricultural, and human resources. This partition will have a lasting impact on international relations and tensions in the 20th century. The great powers celebrate the conference as a diplomatic success, convinced to have avoided a major conflict. At the same time, the First Socialist International Congress is held in Paris in 1889, coinciding with the World's Fair and the inauguration of the Eiffel Tower. Representatives from Europe and America seek to establish common principles to defend workers and promote a more egalitarian society. They create the Second International, aimed at coordinating the actions of socialist parties and setting objectives such as universal suffrage and the limitation of the working day. The idea of international solidarity progresses, despite ideological and strategic divergences. Beyond the Parisian salons and resolutions, industrialization remains often brutal for the working classes. In the mining basins of England or the Ruhr, working life is difficult, with long days and modest wages. Families are crammed into unsanitary neighborhoods, while an elite enjoys the comforts of the emerging modernity. The gap between rich and poor widens, fueling new political demands that resonate in world capitals. At that time, ideas clash. Marxism, economic liberalism, and anarchism seek a model capable of meeting the challenges of industrialization. Throughout the 19th century, technical and scientific progress transforms the worldview. Discoveries in physics and biology open the way to new medical and industrial applications. The concept of bacteria, popularized by Louis Pasteur, evolves medicine and public hygiene. At the same time, railways and steamships accelerate the movement of travelers, facilitating the export of goods and the spread of ideas. International newspapers, assisted by the telegraph, disseminate information faster. World's fairs become showcases where national pavilions, inventions, and innovative machines compete. Political and economic elites observe this effervescence, aware that these transformations will forge the balance of the coming century. In this climate of transition, nothing is certain. Empires, ideologies, and technologies vie for an unpredictable future, unveiling a world with multiple dynamics, both promising and unstable. London, at the end of the 19th century, is the capital of an empire spanning 5 continents. Since the beginning of the Victorian era in 1837, the city has attracted masses of people seeking work, fortune, or simply to escape rural poverty. By 1880, its population exceeds 5 million, surpassing Paris and Vienna. Sailors from Asia, businessmen from America, European intellectuals, and internal migrants cross paths here. The development of the railway and trams facilitates these movements and the expansion of the outer districts. The Port of London, often considered the largest in the world, sees daily arrivals of ships loaded with spices, teas, cottons, silks, and minerals destined for industry. Maritime companies like the Peninsular and Oriental Steam Navigation Company take advantage of Pax Britannica to multiply trade and cultural exchanges. But this bustle does not benefit everyone equally, accentuating social and urban divides. To the south and east of the city, the docklands are saturated by the Second Industrial Revolution. Steel and steam require ever more warehouses, stretching the city along the Thames. The naval traffic is so dense that sailors sometimes wait several days to unload. Thousands of workers live off daily wages, recruited on the spot without job security. Competition is fierce, and a simple injury or day without work can plunge a family into poverty. Industrialization also demands a massive supply of coal, unloaded at the port and then transported to factories. The docks bathe in a fog of soot, reinforcing the image of a gray and dirty neighborhood with acrid smells, contrasting with the splendor of the city center. To the West End symbolizes imperial power with its wide avenues and luxurious mansions, hosting literary salons and clubs of aristocrats and wealthy entrepreneurs. The city, the financial heart, hosts the London Stock Exchange. Nearby, Whitechapel and the East End reveal another face. Dilapidated buildings, dark streets, and extreme crowdedness. Rents are cheaper there, but sanitary conditions are precarious. Sometimes, 3 or 4 people sleep in the same room. Tuberculosis and cholera thrive among those without access to care or adequate food. Public services struggle to keep up with demographic growth, making life difficult in these alleys. This disparity is evident in daily life. While in the West End, high society ladies wear sumptuous dresses and enjoy elegant dinners under gas chandeliers, in Whitechapel, residents struggle to survive. Street vendors sell fruits, vegetables, and old clothes in makeshift markets. Barefoot children wander the streets, hoping to earn a few pence. At night, sidewalks sometimes serve as a refuge for those without a bed. Where gas lamps and nascent electricity light up the West End, the East End makes do with oil lamps and rare gas lights, plunging large areas into shadow. This contrast makes London an emblematic city of Victorian social disparities, giving rise to political tensions and sometimes belated philanthropic initiatives. Among the dramatic phenomena affecting the East End is so-called survival prostitution. In the second half of the 19th century, many women find themselves without resources or social protection. Widows, orphans, or rejected by their families due to an out-of-wedlock pregnancy, alcoholism, violence, or paternal bankruptcy. Some migrate from the countryside hoping for domestic work, but quickly fail. Prostitution then often becomes the only solution to escape extreme poverty or meet basic needs, like renting a bed or buying food. Unlike the courtesans of the West End, these women wander in pubs, alleys, and sidewalks, accepting a few coins to survive. conditions are worsened by unclear regulations and very strict public morality. In 1885, Parliament passed the Criminal Law Amendment Act, strengthening the crackdown on prostitution, trafficking, and the corruption of minors. This law aimed to protect young girls and combat pimping in poor neighborhoods. However, its enforcement in Whitechapel remained complex. The police increased raids and monitoring of taverns, which sometimes exacerbated the distress of women who were arrested, registered, and forced to operate elsewhere in more dangerous areas. At the same time, charitable associations known as rescue societies offered shelters and retraining programs. Their aid sometimes remained the only way out in the absence of social benefits or protection, even though their paternalistic and moral approach could be difficult for these women to endure. Charles Booth, a philanthropist, played a central role in raising awareness of urban poverty at the end of the 1880s. In 1886, he embarked on fieldwork, mobilizing investigators to precisely map the state of living in the East End. With the help of local informants, he collected data on demographics, occupations, housing, and the supposed morality of the inhabitants. His maps, where each street received a color according to the socioeconomic category, revealed an extremely high poverty rate, far exceeding official estimates. The most vulnerable areas, marked in black, suffered from chronic unemployment, overcrowding, and begging. These pockets of poverty concentrated in the East End and some unsanitary districts south of the Thames, such as Bermondsey and Southwark. These maps became a reference for social reformers, who saw them as proof of the need for urgent public interventions. They justified low-cost housing projects, the opening of dispensaries, and the distribution of low-priced food. This work foreshadowed future sociological studies and convinced progressives in the Liberal Party to demand greater state involvement. However, progress remained slow, hindered by the reluctance of the elites to increase tax burdens, deemed harmful to the economy and commerce. Life in the East End, especially in Whitechapel, extended far beyond issues of housing and sanitation. This neighborhood was perceived as a dangerous world, teeming with criminals, vagrants, and opium traffickers. Coal-powered factories emitted suffocating clouds, and the unpaved streets often became quagmires. Slaughterhouses and tanneries added foul odors. In the pubs, where cheap gin flowed freely, drunkenness sometimes led to violent fights. The police often hesitated to intervene in certain corners, fearing being overwhelmed. Yet many immigrant workers, particularly a significant Jewish community from Eastern Europe, settled there, attracted by affordable rent and support networks. This melting pot included Irish, Russian Jews, Asian sailors, Chinese working in small workshops or laundries, adding to the cultural diversity. Amid the rudimentary buildings rose synagogues, neighborhood associations, and missionary churches offering material and spiritual support. In Victorian London, the press praised the progress of modernity, electricity on the main streets, telephones, tramways. But the East End benefited little from these innovations. While wealthy neighborhoods were illuminated by Edison lamps, poor homes remained in darkness, lit by candles or gas. The telephone, which appeared in 1880, remained reserved for the affluent. Access to education, although made compulsory in 1870, remained difficult for impoverished families whose children often had to work to survive. The few free libraries and museums, like the British Museum, were culturally and temporally out of reach for many. London appears as a microcosm of the industrial and colonial world, mixing extreme wealth and poverty. Realistic novels and political pamphlets highlight this paradoxical coexistence. Philanthropists and Anglican pastors attempt to establish food redistribution systems, such as soup kitchens. Religious organizations such as the Salvation Army, founded in 1865, preach abstinence and distribute a few meals. Yet these efforts, deemed superficial, do not change the structural conditions of poverty. The work of Charles Booth, with its detailed maps, incites an unavoidable debate. The East End attracts journalists, photographers, and chroniclers who reveal this world ignored by the bourgeoisie. The poignant accounts published in sensational magazines fuel artistic and political discussions, while dramatic plays captivate a curious audience. Municipal authorities consider concrete improvements, construction of social housing, evacuation of unsanitary neighborhoods, introduction of modern sewers. Some philanthropists build healthier buildings with affordable rents, like those of the Peabody Foundations, but these programs remain insufficient against the growing population. Victorian morality, associating poverty with lack of virtue, often guides debates. Unworthy families are left to fend for themselves or to paternalistic charity. Women prostituting themselves to survive continue to hide in the shadows, fearing arrest or rejection by religious institutions running most of the refuges. Whitechapel, symbol of Victorian woes, is not just a place of suffering. The district remains an artisanal center, particularly in clothing manufacturing and ship repair, and houses an artistic and intellectual scene influenced by socialist ideas. Militant groups call for the limitation of working hours and better worker protection, sometimes organizing demonstrations in the East End. These tensions escalate in an England where freedom of expression is limited and where political power, whether conservative or moderate liberal, rejects these radical ideas that threaten social peace. Unions, particularly the Dockers Union, organized to demand better wages and more security for day laborers. These movements are inspired by the social debate fueled by Booth's cartography, which shows that London remains a fertile ground for class struggle. While the West End embodies the splendor of the British Empire, the East End, with Whitechapel as its center, is a laboratory of social issues. Overcrowded and unsanitary, yet rich in diversity, it houses women forced by the 1885 law to live in the shadows, while rescue societies try to support them. Outside the political sphere, Charles Booth gives a face to each neighborhood through his colorful maps, revealing the social divide and the scale of the challenges. These contrasts between wealth and poverty set the stage for the bloody events that will soon give Whitechapel its infamous reputation. By 1887, Whitechapel in East London establishes itself as the epicenter of urban misery. Thousands of poor immigrants, including Eastern European Jews fleeing persecution, live in cramped accommodations. The dark alleys echo with the cries of street vendors and disputes. Public infrastructure is insufficient, making the night dangerous, while the police, understaffed, struggle to reassure the population. Ill-informed about their rights, many survive day by day. In this chaos, crime quickly flourishes. The forced coexistence stirs suspicion and conflict. Residents point fingers at the newcomers, generating diffuse xenophobia. Sensational newspapers blame foreigners for crimes, while rumors circulate in taverns. Local gangs extend their influence, notably the High Rip, who extort merchants, and the Odessa Boys, coming from the former Russian Empire, who sometimes impose their law by force. Everyone seeks to control a territory, which escalates the violence. The police rarely patrol at night, leaving the field open to illicit activities. The daily life is brutal. Cheap alcohol fuels tragedies, especially in the gin palaces, where unemployed sailors, exhausted mothers, and petty thieves mingle. Fights often break out under the influence of bootlegged drinks, with police intervention being late or non-existent. Women struggle to have their complaints heard, and the cramped housing conditions exacerbate tensions. For many, gin becomes a refuge in the face of a future without prospects. Ethnic tensions are intensifying, with each fight potentially escalating into a collective clash, especially when the press portrays immigrants as responsible for the moral degradation. Jews, mainly Russian or Polish, crowd into squalid boarding houses, enduring scorn and insults. Rumors of targeted attacks, sometimes encouraged by thugs, lead to bloody scuffles. The Odessa boys play an ambiguous role, sometimes protectors, sometimes avengers. Meanwhile, the port attracts sailors and drifters, fueling a constant influx of bewildered new arrivals. A few sordid murders are already causing concern, suggesting a particularly violent killer. In the narrow streets, whispers of a crazy butcher targeting idle women circulate. The press amplifies these rumors, unsure if there is a single killer or multiple ones. Prostitutes, vulnerable and poorly protected, become easy targets. Fear grows, with the feeling that the worst is yet to come. The murder of Emma Elizabeth Smith on the night of April 3, 1888, leaves a mark due to its savagery. Found severely injured, she dies the next day in the hospital, leaving a confused testimony. According to her, several men threatened and beat her, without it being clear whether it was a gang or a lone madman. The police favor the theory of a brutal robbery. In this neighborhood, plagued by numerous gangs, murderous assaults are not uncommon. This case highlights the glaring vulnerability of sex workers, exposed to unchecked violence. A few months later, the discovery of Martha Tabram's body on August 7, 1888, alarms the residents even more. Her corpse shows numerous wounds, a sign of fierce rage. Newspapers hint at the intervention of a mad butcher. The rudimentary forensic examinations cannot confirm a link with the murder of Emma Smith. Nonetheless, the neighborhood is overrun with fear. Rumors of vengeance or a maniac feed the anxiety. Whitechapel now believes a methodical killer is prowling around. The overwhelmed police struggle to provide reassurance. Poverty, overcrowding, and lack of lighting foster a climate of fear. At night, one encounters furtive figures, sometimes armed with knives. In this darkness, murders seem commonplace. Patrols are too rare to monitor every corner. Gin palace owners and prostitutes are wary of suspicious strangers. No one feels safe anymore. The slightest rumor of aggression reinforces the panic. People lock themselves in early or move in groups, hoping to escape the predator. A year earlier, in 1887, the discovery of a headless human torso floating near Limehouse terrifies the population. Quickly, the worst scenarios circulate: sadistic killer, diabolical rite, or gang revenge. The police fail to identify the victim or find the murderer. Newspapers exploit this case to depict a London split between luxury and bloody misery, reinforcing the idea that the slums hide unsuspected monsters. Without modern techniques, investigators cannot link this crime to recent murders. Nonetheless, the headless torso remains at the center of conversations. The victim is often presumed to be a prostitute or a victim of a vendetta. In an environment where violence and poverty coexist, all hypotheses circulate, amplified by the press, which evokes a single, mystical, or professional author hidden in the anonymity of the streets. Whitechapel becomes synonymous with infamous places where women fear working at night. Many try to flee, but poverty holds them back. In this context, gangs like the High Rip and the Odessa Boys strengthen their grip. The police, focused on visible disturbances, neglect complex investigations. Bar discussions revolve around mutilated bodies and tacit complicities as the neighborhood sinks deeper into fear and suspicion. Over the months, rumors suggested a professional butcher, perhaps an assistant surgeon, or seasoned criminals adept at concealment. The sporadic murders continued, fueling a climate of terror. Police advances remained meager, while the press indulged in sensationalism. In this context of alcoholism and prostitution, the idea of a killer targeting vulnerable women struck a sinister chord in Whitechapel. Charitable associations, often religious, struggled to distinguish between rumors and genuine calls for help. They attempted to house the homeless and limit their exposure, while the impoverished population had to coexist with violence, whether domestic or gang-related. The panic triggered by the headless torso never truly disappeared, each murder reigniting fear. At night, the dark streets seemed to hide danger at every corner. In the autumn of 1888, Whitechapel was a feverish neighborhood where survival prostitution, gangs, and pervasive misery intertwined. As night fell, fear mounted on Bucks Row or Hanbury Street. Previous murders remained unsolved, and the headless torso continued to haunt the collective memory. Among rumors, limited police interventions, and sensationalist press, all the ingredients were in place for a more sinister crime. The residents were unaware of the grim escalation about to unfold in their alleyways. Even the most hardened felt the tension. Shopkeepers closed earlier, fearing new tragedies. In this gloomy setting, a few charitable souls tried to aid the destitute, but faced distrust. Whitechapel thus sank further into fear, under the helpless gaze of the police. In the early morning of August 31st, 1888, in the thick fog of Whitechapel in London, Marianne Nichols, known to some as Polly, walked unsteadily on the cold cobblestones. She was 43, and like many women in the East End, survived on sporadic small earnings. Widowed or separated, she often found herself homeless. Victorian England had no social structures to support these marginalized women. During the night, Marianne had wandered through several alleys, meeting familiar faces, coal porters, street vendors, other women seeking shelter, and patrolling policemen. The light of gas lamps flickered on the decrepit facades. At that time, the idea of a serial killer was foreign. Each murder was seen as an isolated incident. However, this last day of August would trigger a series of atrocious crimes. As Marianne approached Bucks Row, no one knew that she would become the first officially recognized victim of the killer who would terrify London. Around 3:20, Charles Cross, a worker, was heading to his job. Tired and gloomy, he stopped upon seeing what seemed to be a bundle of fabric. As he approached, he discovered with horror the lifeless body of a woman. Robert Paul, a passerby, joined him, and they noticed the victim's skirt was raised, suggesting a sexual assault or robbery, although nothing appeared to be missing. Charles placed his hand on her chest, but felt no breath. Panicked, they decided to alert the police. In the dark alleys, drunken or unconscious beggars were common, but the body's stiffness suggested a more serious event. Officer John Neal was patrolling nearby. Alerted, he examined the scene by oil lamp. Buck's row, narrow and dimly lit, complicated his observation. By illuminating her face, he noticed a large gash across the throat and coagulated blood on the clothes. He called for backup and a doctor. Dr. Rhys Ralph Llewellyn arrived, confirming the death. The victim, in a worn dress, showed no other signs of struggle. The attack appeared quick, with a blade wielded with determination. The time of death was estimated to be around 3:30. The victim was identified as Marianne Nichols through her personal effects and a friend's testimony. Her body was transferred to the morgue. The report detailed a deep transverse cut to the throat, severing several major vessels. No robbery had occurred, and her nearly empty purse remained on her. The absence of a struggle suggested either an agile assailant or total surprise. In a miserable East End, women risked their lives on the street, often forced to accept clients at the risk of becoming homeless. This death stood out for its calculated brutality. The rumor began, was a mysterious killer operating in the East End? The population, weary of police ineffectiveness, criticized the slow investigation. The press reported the event, not yet realizing the beginning of a series. In the following days, the police reaction was at the center of discussions. Whitechapel, known for its difficult living conditions, was hard to control. The commissioner of Division H was under pressure. Without reliable witnesses or material evidence, the investigation stalled. Forensic doctors did not yet have modern analysis techniques. Marianne Nichols did not seem to have enemies, and a crime of passion was quickly dismissed. The press constructed the figure of an unknown executioner fueling fear. The upper classes imagined that misery hid monsters, while philanthropists called for more social action. Many saw in this murder the symbol of a failing state. Rumors talked of revenge or debts without foundation. Investigators reconstructed the last hours of Marianne, spotted around 1:20 a.m. in front of a pub, then at 2:30 a.m. with an indistinct male figure. The surrounding alcohol made the testimonies unreliable. Other clues led nowhere. Some journalists pointed out the mundane nature of this death, reminding that isolated women remained vulnerable in deserted alleys. Every morning, the press detailed the known elements, feeding fear and distrust. Dr. Llewellyn insisted on the sharpness of the incision, suggesting a certain anatomical knowledge or manual skill. He supposed the attack had been frontal, the knife piercing with force. Faced with the turmoil, the authorities considered increasing patrols, checking on violent criminals released, and monitoring places frequented by prostitutes. But for lack of resources, these measures remained limited. In the streets where Marianne died, women continued to work at night, exposed to danger. A sense of injustice grew, with many feeling that the city did not protect the most vulnerable. The rumor of a mad butcher spread, reinforcing the anxiety of night-goers. The symbolic importance of the crime grew without any credible suspect emerging. A striking detail of this grim night was the lantern of a watchman, broken as he rushed to understand what was happening. The shattered glass plunged the area into semi-darkness. This setback increased the confusion. Lacking light, it was necessary to grope to distinguish the lifeless body of Marianne Nichols and check if she was still breathing. This incident illustrated the vulnerability of East End streets, where a simple lantern could make the difference between life and death. In 1888, only the flickering light of gas lamps and the basic equipment of a few watchmen were relied upon to navigate at night. The death of Marianne Nichols triggered an unexpected dynamic. Police and press considered the existence of a killer acting in the shadows, exploiting these urban gaps. Bucks Row became the epicenter of a case soon famous beyond British borders. In the following days, the neighborhood speculated about the identity of the murderer. Some spoke of a stranger with a foreign accent prowling after midnight, others of a gang of thugs. Lacking certainties, fear grew. Taverns filled with contradictory rumors, while the police conducted multiple interrogations without result. Few imagined that this death would herald a series of atrocities, making Whitechapel a universal symbol of urban terror. On the morning of September 8, 1888, the nocturnal darkness was just beginning to fade in the Whitechapel district, east of the City of London. The first light revealed poorly lit streets and a crowd of workers heading to work. Before dawn, activity remained low, with markets not yet started, and the sounds of pubs having faded. In this heavy atmosphere, a few residents of Hanbury Street were waking up to start their day. At number 29, a dilapidated building housed poor families and workers. No one suspected that a grisly discovery in the inner courtyard would mark a turning point in the recent murders in the area. The typical East End building featured cramped apartments and a backyard often used as a passage. It was in this corner, accessible through a corridor, that the body of Annie Chapman, a woman in her 40s, was discovered. Around 6 a.m., a resident named John Davis, while leaving, alerted the neighborhood upon discovering this horrific scene. Annie Chapman, nicknamed Dark Annie, was going through financial and personal hardships. Separated from her husband, she lived off small domestic jobs and charity. Her precarious situation exposed her to the dangers of these infamous alleys where the nightlife was often risky. The day before, she had tried to collect money, perhaps by frequenting open establishments or selling objects. Like many in poverty, she sometimes resorted to prostitution to survive. After the recent murder of Marianne Nichols on August 31st, the fear of a lurking killer was growing, but misery led to taking risks, both at night and in the early morning. On site, the scene surpassed in savagery the previous crime. Annie Chapman lay on her back, presenting horrible mutilations. A pool of fresh blood and scattered personal effects testified to the violence of the murder. Dr. George Bagster Phillips, quickly called, described deep slashes to the abdomen and the removal of genital organs, performed with surgical precision, suggesting anatomical knowledge. The inspection sought to understand how such a crime could have occurred in the courtyard without alerting the inhabitants. The doors to the street were closed, but an interior passage allowed access to the courtyard. Several residents were interrogated. A witness reported hearing a brief scream, followed by a thud and an exclamation, "No," in a frightened tone shortly before dawn, between 5:15 and 5:30. Despite this noise, the noisy life of the neighborhood meant that many did not immediately come down. When John Davis discovered Annie Chapman's body, he went to seek help. The apparent calm of the alley was quickly replaced by the commotion of the inhabitants and the police trying to keep away the curious. The brutality of the murder surpassed the usual crimes in the East End. The police in Whitechapel, quickly overwhelmed, requested the help of more experienced inspectors, including Frederick Aberline, already involved in the investigation into Marianne Nichols. Aware of the growing panic, Aberline had guards posted to try to find witnesses. It was necessary to secure the scene, collect evidence, and try to define a modus operandi. The forensic examination revealed similarities with the previous murder: method of throat slashing, cuts to the belly, extreme violence. The press was already talking about a monster. Genital organs had been partially removed, suggesting precise mutilation. Dr. Phillips and his colleagues could not determine if the killer had surgical knowledge, but the cleanliness of certain cuts suggested a certain experience or a lack of repulsion for dissection. Some whispered that the killer could be a butcher, a slaughterman, or someone who had studied medicine. Near the victim, the police found a few objects: a comb, a crumpled piece of paper, and especially 6 pence and 2 rings belonging to Annie Chapman, which had not been stolen. The absence of theft reinforced the idea that the murderer was not acting for material gain, but driven by a darker and more violent motivation. During the investigation, residents reported having seen Annie Chapman the previous night, drunk and looking for money for a bed in a doss house. Some had seen her talking to an unknown man, wearing a dark coat and a typical hat of the working class. Although no witness could formally identify this suspect, these elements painted the picture of a woman in distress, wandering in the alleys of the neighborhood. During the autopsy, Dr. Phillips specified the clean cut of the throat and the particular orientation of the abdominal incisions. Part of the uterus was missing, a horrifying detail that would become the distinctive mark of the related murders. For him, this indicated a certain anatomical skill or a total absence of repugnance. The killer had acted quickly, taking advantage of the ambient noise to go unnoticed, despite the proximity of the inhabitants. The crime scene yielded few other clues. The police searched for bloody footprints and questioned the residents present between 4 and 6 in the morning. A shoemaker declared having heard hesitant footsteps and a murmur without being able to say more. Fear and mistrust towards the police complicated the investigation in this poor neighborhood, where the inhabitants, often intoxicated, were uncooperative. From the early hours, journalists rushed to gather statements. Popular newspapers headlined the "New Victim of the Whitechapel Monster." The information spread quickly thanks to the Telegraph, sparking a debate fueled by speculation. The authorities were sharply criticized for their inability to protect the vulnerable women of the neighborhood, especially since this was the second violent crime in 10 days. The population organized impromptu patrols, while rumors about the identity of the killer multiplied. By targeting Annie Chapman, already known to social services for her fragility, the murderer crossed a line, amplifying the horror. Some claim to have seen a mysterious man lurking several nights before the murder. The cry, "No!" followed by a thud, suggested that Annie might have tried to resist or recognized her attacker. The victim killed in a semi-closed space intensified the dread. Whitechapel was not free from violence, but committing such an act in a place where discovery was likely showed frightening audacity. The police found no overturned lanterns or clear signs of struggle, suggesting the killer subdued his prey with strength or cunning. The detail of the 6 pence and the 2 copper rings left at the scene drew attention. A thief would have grabbed even the smallest coin to survive, but here nothing was touched. This refusal to loot suggested deliberate violence, far from any material motive. The body, similar to that of Marianne Nichols, showed skirts raised to the waist, perhaps to humiliate the victim. The depth of the cuts indicated that the murder was swift. The killer vanished instantly into the labyrinth of alleys around Brick Lane and Commercial Street. A fruit vendor near Spitalfields Market noticed nothing before the discovery, reinforcing the idea of a killer capable of blending into the crowd. Annie Chapman suffered from health problems worsened by malnutrition and alcohol. A widow with no resources, she relied on cheap lodgings and frequented the underprivileged milieu. Witnesses described her as sociable but sometimes irritable, reflecting distress in a city where social protection remained insufficient. Her death on September 8, 1888, marked an escalation of violence, confirming the repetition of a morbid ritual in the same neighborhood. No precise description of the companion before dawn remained, but rumors and paranoia grew, mentioning a respectable stranger or an enthusiast of sharp knives. The idea of a calculating assassin took shape, while vigils multiplied, led by plainclothes police or terrified citizens. On the forensic level, the removal of internal organs marked a major difference from the previous murder of Marianne Nichols. Dr. Phillips noted that the pelvic and abdominal regions showed more advanced anatomical knowledge than expected. Some speculated that it might be a mad doctor, a failed student, or an individual fascinated by morbid dissection. Doctors disagreed. Some imagined a madman guided by a fantasy of violence, others a killer with some experience handling a blade. Residents then demanded better protection, asking for more patrols and enhanced public lighting, while most street lamps remained dim, gas-powered, covering only a small portion of the district. To calm the psychosis, authorities increased the forces in the East End and organized more patrols. Undercover investigators mingled with night wanderers, listening in search of clues. But the communication between the Metropolitan Police and the City Police, separated by the border near Whitechapel, remained insufficient. This compartmentalization, added to the lack of technical means, slowed down the sharing of vital information. The brutality of the mutilations also aroused unhealthy curiosity. Some bystanders claimed to aid in surveillance, while they just wanted to see the crime scene. The tension mounted, and fear spread rapidly. The items found near Annie Chapman's body, notably 6 pence and 2 copper rings, fueled conversations in the pubs. While the police were searching for leads, residents were already exchanging urban legends about a supposed message from the assassin. Some saw a ritual gesture, others thought the killer, in a hurry, had not stolen. This absence of theft highlighted that the individual focused on the bloody act, reinforcing the resentment in a neighborhood where every shilling counted. The body of Annie Chapman was transported to the morgue for a complete post-mortem examination. Those present at the recovery of the body were shocked, and some unofficial reports described nightmarish visions. The material evidence, bloodstains, pieces of cloth, did not undergo thorough analysis, as forensic techniques remained rudimentary. Fingerprinting and DNA analysis were not yet in use. The police had to rely on deduction and the cross-checking of often contradictory or incomplete testimonies. In the following days, it was learned that Annie Chapman had encountered several vagrants, but none could identify the person who accompanied her before the murder. A resident of 27 Hanbury Street claimed to have heard voices shortly before 5:30 in the morning, thinking it was just a simple quarrel. She perceived an aggressive tone before falling back asleep. The echo of a brief "no" now resonated as Annie Chapman's tragic cry, pleading with her assailant. Despite the reinforced police presence, fear persisted, with everyone dreading another attack. The horror of the scene at 29 Hanbury Street shook public opinion and questioned Victorian society about the neglect of the destitute. How could a woman so desperate suffer such barbarity at the heart of the British Empire? The debates expanded, pushing the government and the municipality to consider urban and police reforms. For now, attention remained focused on the pursuit of an elusive culprit. Finally, an anecdote circulated for a long time in Whitechapel. Despite the extreme violence, Annie Chapman's 6 pence and 2 small copper rings remained intact by her side. This detail symbolized the blind cruelty of the assailant and the deep injustice inflicted on those who, already deprived of everything, also lost their most basic dignity. September 30th, 1888, is marked in the London criminal annals under the name Double Event. That night, 2 women were killed less than an hour apart. The first murder, that of Elizabeth Stride, occurred in a dark alley of Whitechapel called Burner Street. Less than 45 minutes later, Catherine Eddowes was found dead in Mitre Square in the neighboring city of London. For the residents of the East End, already terrified by the previous crimes, this double tragedy heightened the fear of a killer on the loose. The authorities, despite their vigilance, seemed overwhelmed by the growing violence. This date was a turning point in the series of murders attributed to Jack the Ripper. For several weeks, Whitechapel had been shaken by a series of crimes, primarily targeting poor women forced into prostitution. Burner Street illustrated the vulnerability of the East End's inhabitants. A narrow street bordered by dilapidated houses and dark courtyards, with a socialist mission sometimes attracting political meetings. Nightlife remained poorly lit, and many transactions took place in its corners. Elizabeth Stride eked out a living as best she could. Originally from Sweden, Elizabeth had lived in London for over 20 years. Despite her faded accent, she struggled with poverty and alcoholism. Lodging at low cost, she faced cold and danger each night. Around 1 a.m., she was seen with an unknown man dressed in dark clothing, vaguely described, tall, mustachioed, speaking English with an uncertain accent. The police could not establish a reliable portrait. Shortly after 1 a.m., a coachman, Louis Deemschutz, entered Dutfield's yard, a courtyard near Burner Street where the social club was located. He noticed a body on the ground, initially thinking it was a drunken woman, but the light revealed Elizabeth Stride, her throat slit and blood still fresh. Unlike the other victims, her body showed no mutilation, no abdominal slashes or removed organs. Investigators believed the quick intervention had interrupted the assassin. This murder was deemed incomplete or aborted. The absence of post-mortem abuse suggested that the killer did not have time to perform his usual bloody ritual. Only the throat had been cut with a precise gesture, showing mastery of the blade. Inspector Frederick Aberline quickly cordoned off the area. But in this dense and poorly lit neighborhood, controlling comings and goings remained impossible. The murderer's escape seemed likely. While witnesses were being questioned, no one suspected that a second murder was about to follow so quickly. Not far from there, in London City, Mitre Square was less frequented at this hour. Between 1:30 and 2 a.m., several officers were patrolling. Officer Watkins passed by at 1:44 without noticing anything. But at 1:45 or 1:46, luck turned against Catherine Eddowes. Shortly after, Officer Harvey entered from another street, saw no one. Then Watkins returned and found Catherine's body. Her throat was cut, her abdomen horribly mutilated, and some organs were missing. This second crime, occurring about 45 minutes after that of Elizabeth Stride, had all the characteristics attributed to Jack the Ripper. The deep cuts, the violence to the abdomen, organ extractions, the left kidney and part of the uterus, according to forensic doctors, everything seemed to match a monstrous signature. The assassin had operated in almost total darkness between two police rounds in a remarkably short time. This precision reinforced speculations about certain anatomical expertise, with some newspapers mentioning a surgeon or a butcher, feeding public hysteria. Catherine Eddowes, of English origin and very destitute like Elizabeth Stride, had been briefly put in a drunk tank the previous night. Released around 1 a.m., she apparently left in a jovial mood, according to a policeman. No one knew how she ended up at Mitre Square or if she met a client there. Her death shocked the public because the City of London seemed less exposed to such acts than Whitechapel. The assassin had proven he could strike beyond the usual limits. Another clue stirred the population. On the probable escape route, on Goulston Street, a police officer spotted a bloody piece of apron around 2:55 a.m., identified as coming from Catherine Eddowes' apron. This fabric, stained with blood and carefully cut, was likely used to wipe or transport a removed organ. Above it was a chalk graffiti. "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The approximate spelling and ambiguous syntax generated much ink, the word Jewess being linked to the anti-Semitic context of the East End. The tension towards the local Jewish community was already high. Many immigrants, especially Jews fleeing pogroms in the Russian Empire, sought refuge in Whitechapel and Spitalfields. This massive immigration sparked prejudices and resentment. The inscription took on an explosive dimension. Interpreted as an accusation, it risked provoking anti-Semitic riots. In response, Commissioner Charles Warren ordered the text to be erased before it could be photographed or copied. Some considered this decision detrimental to the investigation, but Warren feared an uprising if it was believed that the killer was Jewish or wanted to incite the crowd to hatred. The piece of apron on Goulston Street became a tangible link between the crime and this mysterious message, seen by the press as the signature of the assassin, seeking to spread panic. Journalists saw it as a provocation, a challenge to authorities, or a desire to exacerbate racial tensions. Others thought it was a simple coincidence or a manipulation to discredit the Jewish population. The forensic doctors concluded that the killer had probably taken the organs. The precision of the cut and the rapidity puzzled professionals. Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown participated in the autopsy. Dr. George Bagster Phillips, having examined a previous crime, noted an escalation in violence. Some believed that the assassin had anatomical knowledge, possibly professional training, while others thought of a meticulous individual capable of striking quickly and efficiently. The motive remained unclear. Why two crimes in the same night? Was Elizabeth Stride's murder interrupted by witnesses, forcing the killer to act elsewhere? Was the proximity of a socialist club a factor? Was the second attack fulfilling an unmet macabre need? Investigators only had hypotheses. Without formal witnesses and with contradictory reports, the pursuit became complex, with some fearing the time for capture had passed. The media fallout from the double event was intense. The headlines amplified the horror with often exaggerated descriptions of the mutilations, prompting the public to demand more security. Yet, Whitechapel remained poorly lit. The police lacked quick resources or effective communication. The telegraph existed, but there was no real-time coordination. The press sought to captivate with blood, the blade, the bloody apron, feeding into collective fears. In this atmosphere, the Goulston Street graffiti took on an outsized importance, sparking a debate more animated than the facts themselves. Rumors and contradictory testimonies circulated, some speaking of an individual holding the apron, others of a coat stained with blood. There was talk of an anti-Semitic plot to incriminate the Jewish community. The police forces diverged on strategy. Witnesses hesitated to speak, fearing being implicated in such a troubling affair. The rare statements remained confused, complicating the investigation. Despite an active search, the most tangible clue remained this strip of fabric taken from Catherine Eddowes' skirt. The analyses of the time, limited, allowed only for visual observation and some rudimentary tests. It was simply confirmed that it was indeed the same garment Eddowes wore, and that the cut had been made with a sharp knife. It was impossible to determine if there were fingerprints or other exploitable traces. The oil or gas lamps made it difficult to inspect at night, and techniques for preserving the crime scene did not yet exist. The rain and humidity of London risked quickly altering these pieces of evidence. This piece of bloody apron, abandoned in Goulston Street, became almost a cult object in the popular imagination around the Whitechapel crimes. The newspapers saw it as the tangible mark of an assassin on the run, a sinister symbol of his own assurance. Discussion clubs burned with attempts to decipher each word of the graffiti, questioning the meaning of Jewess. Some read it as Jews, others as a Masonic echo, evoking Jubela, Jubilo, and Jubilum, legendary figures from Solomon's Temple. But nothing solidly supported this lead in the official investigation. Everything remained conjecture, fueling a climate of general suspicion. At Mitre Square, as well as Burner Street, the crime scene was quickly cleaned after initial inspections. The residents, numerous but silent, remained shut in, terrified at the idea of the murderer's return. The police tried to calm the spirits, yet some officers anonymously expressed their concern: how to stop someone fleeing so quickly in a maze of dark alleys. Whitechapel, already marked by thefts, assaults, and misery, sank into uncontrollable psychosis. At every sighting of a suspicious individual, the police intervened, but the leads were in vain. Several men were questioned, then released. That night, no one was found bearing traces of blood or behaving guiltily. The suspects remained as ephemeral as shadows gliding over soot-covered walls. Meanwhile, the press followed in real time every slightest development. The thesis of the same methodical assassin took root, while the public demanded drastic measures. The tension between the city police and the Metropolitan Police grew, each service wanting to demonstrate its effectiveness in the eyes of the public. This double event starkly confronted the nocturnal conditions in poor neighborhoods. Berners Street, south of Commercial Road, symbolized the slums and clandestine atmospheres of East London. Mitre Square, on the city side, represented more the commercial spaces deserted at night. The juxtaposition of these two worlds highlighted the reach of a killer capable of crossing the invisible borders between districts, defying the difficult coordination between police forces. The fear spread. If Whitechapel was the initial focus, striking in more guarded territory showed that no place was safe. Despite a general shock, evidence remained scarce. Forensic doctors thought the murder weapon was likely a long, thin knife between 15 to 20 centimeters. The presence of a bag to carry the organs remained uncertain. Investigators imagined a killer able to move easily, dressed in a dark coat, capable of concealing his actions. Regarding Elizabeth Stride, some mentioned a man holding a wrapped package without it being officially noted. Doubt persisted about the suspect's mental state. Did he suffer from psychological disorders, or was he an organized predator? The simultaneous murders of Stride and Eddowes highlighted the criminal's rapid brutality, reinforcing the police's sense of helplessness. Rumors grew around letters signed Jack the Ripper, especially after the murders of Marianne Nichols and Annie Chapman. Even before the autopsies were completed, newspapers reported new mocking, sometimes threatening messages. The horror became almost theatrical. Each detail, apron piece, graffiti, letters, feeding the fear of a demon prowling the streets. On September 30th, 1888, the violence was clear. A throat slit in a courtyard, followed by a dissection exposed to a police officer. The Jewish quarter, already tense, feared reprisals and accusations. Newspapers debated the Goulston Street graffiti, while the police erased any trace that might fuel hatred. Some approved of this gesture to avoid discord, others criticized it, believing it deprived the investigation of evidence. This blood-stained apron remnant, proof of the killer's passage, became a terrifying symbol of the Whitechapel case. The night of the double event drew hundreds of curious people around Berners Street and Mitre Square, hoping for a sign or a moment of reflection. The police tried to contain this curiosity, fearing it might compromise the crime scenes. Witnesses spoke of faint cries or figures fleeing in the shadows, without any possibility of identification. The fear grew, fueled by the rapidity of the two successive murders. This September 30th placed Whitechapel in major crisis. The discovery of Elizabeth Stride, minimally mutilated, indicated an interrupted act, while the complete murder of Catherine Eddowes showed that the killer dared to strike in the city, considered safer. The bloody apron, left voluntarily or by mistake, seemed to provoke or obfuscate the trail. Still unaware of the extent of this case, police and population lived in terror, awaiting answers that would not come. The investigation reached its limits, and the threat remained stronger than ever. In the cold dawn of November 9th, 1888, Whitechapel awoke under a fog absorbing the glow of the few gas lamps. The inhabitants, already frightened by a series of atrocious murders, were unaware that an unprecedented tragedy had just occurred. Mary Jane Kelly, a young woman of about 25, lived at 13 Miller's Court near Dorset Street. Unlike previous victims found on the street, she was murdered in the intimacy of her room, marking a new level of horror. Around 10 a.m., Thomas Bowyer, the landlord's messenger, discovered her mutilated body. Looking through a broken window, he saw mutilations of unprecedented scale. The police quickly dispatched Inspector Frederick Aberline and his colleagues. Upon arriving, they found an unparalleled crime scene, an outburst of violence in a confined space. The murder of Mary Jane Kelly was distinguished by the severity of the mutilations. Her body was dismembered to an unmatched degree, her face unrecognizable. Some organs had been removed, suggesting either anatomical knowledge or a ritual dimension. Forensic doctors tried to link this crime to other homicides. This atrocity testified to a psychic chaos or a growing skill, encouraged by the ability to act out of sight. For the first time, the scene was photographed, preserving a permanent visual testimony of the murderer's brutality. This technical progress marked a major turn for police investigation. The indoor discovery raises questions. How could the killer have acted without attracting attention? The dwellings in Whitechapel are cramped with thin walls, yet no one heard any prolonged struggle. A neighbor mentioned a faint cry for help but paid no attention. The bloodstains on the walls and floor indicate a violent attack, with neither door nor window broken. Some believe Kelly let her attacker in, perhaps someone she knew or someone offering to pay her debts. Her poverty made her vulnerable. Her rent had been overdue for several days, the financial pressure mounting. On the mantelpiece, a pinned rent note is a stark reminder of her precariousness. This detail highlights the contrast between everyday realities such as paying debts and the unimaginable savagery that befell her. As the police make their observations, the press on site feeds the bloody chronicle. Information circulates via the Telegraph, giving the case international reach. Mary Jane Kelly becomes a tragic symbol of the social deadlock of London's East End. The extreme ferocity observed in Kelly's room sparks differing hypotheses. Some experts believe the killer is gradually losing control over his impulses, driving his actions into a frenzied outburst, a sign of growing disorganization. Others see it as increased mastery, gained over multiple murders. With the victim isolated, the criminal had the time required for his gruesome designs. Inspectors, including Aberline, search for material clues, footprints, abandoned tools, testimony of comings and goings. But the scene is so chaotic, it's hard to distinguish a reliable clue from the bloody mess. Scattered clothes, a smashed table, bloody handprints, with no certainty as to their origin. Without electricity, analysis is done by the light of oil lamps, in the oppressive narrowness of the squalid dwelling. Post-mortem photography, though innovative, remains a simple snapshot of horror, useful for comparison with autopsy reports. Surgeons discover a mutilated face, some body parts nearly unrecognizable. The manipulation of internal organs reveals an unprecedented cruelty, possible thanks to the time provided by the isolation. This arrangement confirms it is the same killer as in previous murders, which already showed attempts at organ extraction under more vulnerable conditions. Fear grows. If the killer can enter his victim's home and proceed as such, no one knows where he will strike next, shaking confidence in the Victorian police. The cramped room of Miller's Court becomes an iconic sight, the theater of the peak violence embodied by Jack the Ripper. Neighbors gather on the street. The press publishes morbid details about the removed organs, the state of the body, or Kelly's thin layer. Some journalists mention an almost artistic gesture in the staging, reinforcing the image of a calculating and defiant killer. Authorities struggle to contain the crowd. The question of the victim's identity also raises questions. Kelly is said to have lived under several aliases and claimed to be Irish or Welsh. Poverty, which forces frequent changes of residence and identity, feeds the mystery around her life, adding a tragic aura to her fate. Aberline and his colleagues log every detail: angles of incisions, position of the bed, moved objects, signs of struggle. But without fingerprints or blood analyses, reaching a conclusion remains elusive. Medical examiners note similarities with previous crimes: removal of female organs, indicating a hatred or morbid need for possession. Some suggest a possible link to strange rites, but offer no proof. The modus operandi is chiefly characterized by an atrocious mutilation intended to sow terror in London. By the end of the first inspection, all understand this case will mark criminal history. Posterity will notably remember the rent note, hanging above a pool of blood, as a silent cry symbolizing Kelly's distress. On orders from superiors, the room is thoroughly searched, and the police confiscate anything that might be useful. The question of whether this atrocious murder reveals a chaotic disorder or a growing skill divides observers. Proponents of the frenzied killer thesis emphasize the relentlessness and irrational nature of the injuries, which make the victim unrecognizable. According to them, this explosive rage indicates a fragile psyche, especially since the murderer takes risks in a home where an unexpected visitor could appear. The other camp sees in the choice of this confined place a calculated audacity. Freed from the fear of being interrupted, the killer perfects his sinister technique. They consider a logical progression, with the assassin initially attempting to harvest organs in the street before taking advantage of shelter to satisfy his macabre desires. This divergence fuels lively debates, while it is noted that, despite its barbarity, the crime follows a certain coherence. The final photograph of Mary Jane Kelly, taken as her body lay on the bed, circulates among officials and a few doctors, evoking rarely equaled dread. For the first time, a Victorian crime scene is immortalized so explicitly, this image leaving a lasting impact on the collective imagination. Subsequently, contradictory medical reports attribute anatomical skills or merely unrestrained cruelty to the killer. The rumor soon transcends the borders of the United Kingdom, igniting Europe and America. How can a neighborhood in the capital of the most powerful empire allow such atrocities? While continental police forces watch, Whitechapel freezes in fear of another offense. The body of Mary Jane Kelly represents the climax of this escalation, and many suppose the killer then vanishes like a shadow, leaving the city to heal its wounds. In the days following, the room is quickly emptied and re-rented, a bitter sign of the prevailing misery. Investigators leave with a sense of powerlessness, aware that this case reveals the dark depths of evil lurking in the East End. The end of summer 1888 plunges the London police into an unprecedented situation. The bloody murders in Whitechapel, marked by unusual mutilations, severely test an investigative system still very imperfect. The methods rely mostly on observation, testimonies, and an intuition called flair. Investigators face unprecedented technical difficulties, insufficient lighting, lack of centralized criminal records, complicating the pursuit of an elusive culprit. The efforts of inspectors Frederick George Aberline, Edmund Reed, and Donald Swanson reveal both a willingness to modernize procedures and rivalry between departments. The press relays rumors and pressures, while the police must solve the case under the eyes of public authorities and opinion. Aberline, a former watchmaker, knows Whitechapel well, where he has already fought criminal networks linked to prostitution and counterfeiting. His pragmatic methods consist of questioning residents, pub owners, and pimps, cross-checking each testimony. But fear and silence reign in these poorly lit streets, and the population distrusts the police, viewed as a tool of repression. Despite this, Aberline strives to gain the trust of influential figures, hoping for leads. Calm and tenacious, he attempts to maintain a united team, but must contend with dissensions and competition from other police branches. Inspector Edmund Reed at the local post knows well the social realities of the East End, populated by immigrants and precarious workers, a breeding ground for violence. Confronted with often contradictory testimonies and xenophobic prejudices, he filters out unfounded hypotheses to focus on real clues. Armed with his incident register, he compares nighttime reports, often reduced to silhouettes or coat colors. Reed increases patrols and collaborates closely with the bobbies, officers on foot, to spot suspicious behavior. Donald Swanson at Scotland Yard coordinates the information from Whitechapel. His administrative rigor favors a more methodical, even scientific approach, but resources remain limited, no fingerprints or blood analyses. Communication by letter and telegram causes delays, while internal rivalries create an unhealthy atmosphere. Swanson advocates for the centralization of clues, convinced that the exchange of information is the key, but each inspector follows their own leads, pressed by the fear of another murder. Investigators face derisory tools. The streets, lit by flickering oil lamps, conceal malevolent shadows. The absence of electric lighting makes nighttime tracking nearly impossible. Frequent fog complicates detection. A simple lamp failure can compromise a patrol. At crime scenes, no standardized procedure preserves evidence. Curious onlookers can trample traces. Constables, without forensic training, often just cover the body while waiting for inspectors. This slowness compromises the initial state of the scene by the time the officials arrive. The limitations of the Victorian police are particularly evident in material evidence. Dactyloscopy, or fingerprint identification, was only introduced in England at the beginning of the 20th century. In 1888, it was unknown that each individual has a unique fingerprint pattern. Investigators sometimes collected boot prints from mud or blood, but they were rarely usable due to a lack of appropriate techniques. Similarly, blood group analysis remained a medical advancement still inaccessible to the police. Thus, they had to rely on cross-references, fragmentary testimonies, and conjectures. For instance, a witness might report a man carrying a knife, but the police couldn't verify without finding a matching weapon, which was rare. In a context where butcher knives were common due to London slaughterhouses, this clue was of little value unless it bore particular marks. Thus, the police struggled to gather tangible evidence, leaving room for suspicions, rumors, and errors. An episode illustrates these difficulties: the Bloodhounds experiment. Under the impulse of aristocrat Lyttelton Gell, the police attempted to use tracking dogs known for their sense of smell to follow the traces left by the killer in the streets of Whitechapel. But the experiment quickly failed. The dogs, unaccustomed to urban noise and crowds, got lost on their first outing, unable to focus on a trail. The press ridiculed this initiative, highlighting police shortcomings, and the project was abandoned. Meanwhile, Prime Minister William Ewart Gladstone was said to have visited Whitechapel incognito to gauge the social unrest and police challenges. Disguised, he supposedly wandered the alleys and briefly interacted with passers-by without revealing his identity. Although no official document confirms this visit, the anecdote reflects the urgency and embarrassment of the government in the face of an unsuccessful investigation. By the late 1880s, the Victorian press was undergoing a rapid transformation, driven by technological advancements and social changes shaking London and England. Penny newspapers, accessible to a wide public, multiplied, supported by an expanding distribution network. Improved rotary presses allowed for quick printing of numerous copies, while the telegraph transmitted information almost instantly from British cities and abroad. The quest for news, including dramas, crimes, and gossip, reached unprecedented levels. The series of bloody murders attributed to Jack the Ripper in the Whitechapel district became one of the first cases to engage this press hungry for sensational news. Readers followed with emotion the macabre discoveries and daily speculations. Publishers, aware of the commercial potential, multiplied sensational headlines, capturing attention beyond London. The affair quickly extended beyond its local context to engage an international readership. The telegraph, perfected since the 1850s, revolutionized the speed of exchanges, allowing newsrooms to receive dispatches within hours, fueling a constant rumor around an elusive killer. Editors often secured exclusives and printed supplements with the smallest development. The fear spread far beyond the East End. However, this coverage fueled anti-Semitic stereotypes. Part of the press highlighted the presence of Jewish populations among suspects or in the vicinity, spreading rumors of conspiracies and dark portrayals of Eastern European immigrants. Some titles mentioned barbaric rituals, reinforcing an unjust distrust toward the Jewish community. Despite warnings from a few serious journalists, this sensationalist treatment worsened social tensions in the East End. The satirical magazine Punch exploits the subject with cartoons opposing Jack the Ripper to urban misery, pointing out the gap between Victorian extravagance and poverty. The Ripper becomes a metaphor for the neglect of disadvantaged neighborhoods, while critiques of municipal authorities are discreetly inserted into these widely disseminated images. In addition, iconic places like the Madame Tussauds Wax Museum capitalized on the public's fascination by offering macabre exhibitions, with reconstructions of crime scenes and mannequins representing the supposed mutilations. This morbid entertainment anchors the case in collective memory while feeding the appetite for gory details. Competition among cheap newspapers is intense. Each daily seeks to offer shocking exclusives, real or invented testimonies, letters from the killer, sensational medical analyses. The information, often poorly verified, spreads quickly, fueling many rumors. False testimonies emerge, some looking to cash in on their stories or alleged conversations with the Ripper. This frenzy creates a cult of sensational news where every detail, true or false, increases sales. The dramatic headlines emphasize the horror of the mutilations and the supposed intelligence of the killer. The Victorian society, enthralled by ghost stories and Gothic novels, is absorbed in this invisible figure striking at night. The gruesome details, from the weapon to the positions of the bodies, stimulate growing voyeurism. These publications, sold by the thousands, amplify insecurity in poor neighborhoods. In return, they push the authorities to intensify their investigations, but also reinforce the criticisms against the police deemed ineffective. The Telegraph favors the emergence of more dynamic publications. Several successive editions of the same newspaper appear throughout the day, adding or correcting information. The public becomes accustomed to this immediacy and expects each development to make the headlines. Kiosks in both the West End and the East End become rumor hubs where passersby discuss the latest headlines. This rapid circulation of news, amplified by morbid curiosity, fuels worldwide enthusiasm for the case, picked up by French, German, or American newspapers. The Victorian press also multiplies illustrated supplements, where engravings attempt to depict the alleys of Whitechapel and the state of the found bodies. This visual representation mixes Gothic style and emerging realism. The captivated readers seek every detail to unravel the mystery of the killer. Publishers encourage this indirect participation by publishing accounts from amateur detectives or self-proclaimed mediums, blurring the line between reporter and reader and fueling the collective obsession. Commercial pamphlets multiply, selling souvenir engravings or booklets of exclusive revelations. Entrepreneurs exploit the enthusiasm, aware that any link with Jack the Ripper finds an immediate audience. Some publishers even offer special editions compiling all published articles, thus creating dossiers. This frenzied marketing illustrates the birth of a mass culture where sensational news occupies a central place. The most revealing initiative remains the crime tours offered from 1889 by advertising agents. These dramatized guided tours lead the curious to the sites of the victims' discoveries. Explanatory panels, sometimes improvised, promise an authentic experience to emotionally involved visitors. The guides reiterate popular rumors, describing the killer as aristocratic or foreign butcher. This commercial staging of fear prompts other neighborhoods to create their own sensational circuits. Interest in sensational news in the Victorian press marks a break from traditions focused on politics, economics, and diplomacy. The public's interest in atrocious crimes often surpasses that for social reforms or parliamentary debates, making sensational news a profitable and sensational material. Investors support newspapers capable of delivering as many details as possible, while the expanding urban middle class demands its daily dose of emotions. Crime chronicles become a societal phenomenon, fueled by telegraphic correspondences and on-site reporting. Many journalists seek to distinguish themselves by publishing witness interviews or bold theories, amplifying the impact with flashy headlines. Some voices are raising concerns about the dangers of this sensationalism, fearing that the press, by focusing on Jack the Ripper, might glorify violence and provoke copycats. Yet, the public's fascination remains insatiable, with new twists, real or imagined, emerging each week. Penny newspapers, the Telegraph, caricatures, and sensational exhibitions keep the public's attention, embedding the Victorian press in the era of sensational news. Educated readers keep asking for more. In 1888, forensic medicine is still in its infancy but is garnering growing interest among British authorities. Technical advancements are limited. There are no fingerprint databases or criminology records yet. Faced with a series of murders in London's East End, doctors undertake a detailed study of the anatomical clues. Dr. Thomas Bond, an expert in surgery and autopsy, establishes himself as a pioneering figure. He gathers forensic observations, nature of incisions, intensity of blows, body positions, to better understand a killer who defies all logic. This novel approach mixes traditional autopsy methods with the aim to establish a mental portrait of the criminal, foreshadowing psychological profiling. In December 1888, Bond writes a report summarizing his findings on several victims murdered in a similar manner. He details the depth, length, and orientation of the wounds to assess whether they indicate surgical expertise or uncontrolled rage. The analysis shows that some precise incisions suggest a deep understanding of anatomy. The lack of struggle on some bodies indicates an attacker who was swift, surprising his prey. The time of death, evaluated through muscle rigidity and residual temperature, appears to be close to when the victims were last seen. These clues reveal an alarming efficiency. The killer acts within minutes in the dark without being detected. At the end of the 19th century, the absence of a structured forensic police force forces investigators to rely on intuition and the empirical methods of doctors. Bond goes further by formulating hypotheses about the killer's personality. The precise sequence of homicides and the geographical distribution of crime scenes suggest an individual accustomed to moving without attracting attention. A feeling of hatred towards certain women could motivate the mutilations, revealing a mental disturbance rather than a simple desire for theft. Emerging psychiatric theories lead him to consider waking nightmares or nocturnal impulses. Even though the notions of perversion or psychopathy are not fully established, Bond uses a vocabulary foreshadowing the search for an intimate motive or a psychological trauma. Autopsies become more refined. Injuries are better cataloged, bodies photographed, and cases sometimes compared between cities through shared reports. Fingerprint analysis remains non-existent, and police rely on vague descriptions from often frightened witnesses. Bond advocates for the standardization of practices, convinced that a detailed recording of blows would help identify an assailant's signature. He emphasizes the importance of the time of death, determined by cadaveric rigidity and post-mortem contractions. These techniques, though limited, already bring scientific rigor to the investigation, laying the foundations of modern forensics. Meanwhile, forensic toxicology is emerging to detect the use of chemical substances. Since the beginning of the century, rudimentary tests exist for arsenic, feared for its ease of use, and to a lesser extent for chloroform, used to subdue a victim. In the context of the London murders, Bond checks if these substances played a role. Tissues are analyzed with chemical reagents, but detection remains uncertain, with no guarantee of finding traces if the substance has evaporated. Despite these limitations, combining anatomical examination and toxin study marks a step toward integrated forensic medicine. Bond is interested in the order of mutilations, noting that some wounds are post-mortem, suggesting a macabre ritual or a challenge to investigators. Anatomists note the regularity of certain incisions, indicating a sharp instrument wielded by an expert hand, while other murderers display anarchic violence oscillating between planning and impulsiveness. This ambiguity fuels speculation about the mental health of the killer, with some mentioning fits of lucid madness. Bond does not make a definitive judgment, but insists on the importance of comparing modus operandi, convinced that repeating a pattern could reveal a clue, thus laying the foundations of forensic criminology. On a psychological level, he attempts to profile a reclusive, solitary assassin, frequenting seedy neighborhoods without attracting attention, often acting at night. He imagines that the criminal might calmly return home and smoke to relax, describing this behavior as nocturnal, inveterate smoker. Without direct evidence, this projection reveals an innovative approach that goes beyond mere anatomical description. These early profiling attempts sparked debates beyond the medical field. The sensationalist press distorts his theories, depicting a monster with surgical knowledge or a sexual madman, concepts at the time confused with mere moral deviance. Bond remains cautious, reminding that without proof, these hypotheses must be approached with rigor. Nevertheless, he conveys his findings to the police, hoping that his observations on incisions and removed organs will help identify the suspect. Among investigators, the lack of clear protocols hampers the use of forensic advances. Evidence is sometimes mishandled, and the crime scene poorly secured. Bond advocates for better police medical coordination, restricted access to sites, logging of objects, and photographing scenes. He also underscores the importance of examining gastric contents to detect alcohol or ingested substances. These recommendations often go unheeded, hindered by bureaucracy and lack of training. In his December 1888 report, Bond outlines a hypothetical portrait of the murderer, a middle-aged man, discreet, with dubious hygiene, avoiding social contacts, nocturnal, inveterate smoker, driven by an inner compulsion rather than material gain. This profile does not lead to an immediate arrest, but paves the way for a new approach combining psychological analysis and material evidence. His remarks foreshadow the idea that an assassin leaves as many clues in their modus operandi as in the violence of their acts, embodying the burgeoning rise of forensic medicine and future criminological disciplines. This effort at psychological characterization, although imperfect, makes Bond one of the first forensic doctors to insist on the importance of behavioral analysis. His colleagues, sometimes skeptical, recognize the novelty of his approach. Through his reports, he anticipates the idea that deciphering a criminal's motivations and secret habits will make forensic medicine more effective in the service of justice. When the Whitechapel murders begin to make the headlines in the London press in August 1888, the population is still unaware of how much the letters will fuel fear. Quickly, the Metropolitan Police receive a series of messages purportedly sent by the killer. One of the first, the Dear Boss letter, made public at the end of September, attracts attention. Signed Jack the Ripper, it contains explicit threats against the prostitutes of Whitechapel. Its mocking tone and bloody details fascinate as much as they frighten. The fluctuating spelling of the nickname only amplifies the rumor. Soon after, another letter signed Saucy Jackie reaches Scotland Yard. Shorter, it maintains the same provocative tone, boasting of upcoming crimes. Investigators are puzzled, same author or imitator. The foreign press relays these pseudonyms, making Jack the Ripper a global symbol of horror. In London, fear grows, and other pranksters take advantage by sending fake letters. The popular press, booming, plays a central role. Cheap newspapers publish every purported message, often with sensational headlines. The public is fascinated by the case. Some engage in the investigation, others send in their own letters. The police, overwhelmed, examine each piece of mail without the modern tools, like DNA analysis or digital handwriting comparison. Lacking better options, they rely on a few graphologists, which leads to many disagreements. Despite everything, the Dear Boss and Saucy Jackie letters remain among the most credible due to their style and alignment with the autumn 1888 murders. With the proliferation of letters, the line between reality and hoax becomes blurred. Some missives contain verifiable details, others are pure fantasy. The police receive more than 1,200 letters related to the case. Each one must be opened, examined, classified. This workload represents a significant logistical burden, but no lead is dismissed, even when the content seems absurd. Among the mailings, the From Hell letter received in October leaves a mark with a macabre element, a piece of a human organ, likely a kidney. The parcel, addressed to the president of a vigilance committee, is accompanied by a chaotic message claiming the organ was taken from a victim. Medical experts struggle to determine its authenticity, only amplifying the horror. In the streets, news of the liver parcel is deeply shocking. For the public, these tangible proofs give the killer an almost supernatural aura between myth and reality. Historians still debate the authenticity of the letters attributed to the assassin, like From Hell, Dear Boss, or Saucy Jackie. Some highlight their stylistic similarities and their publication in connection with key events. Others believe they could be from journalists seeking sensation or individuals craving recognition. But beyond their origin, the effect on the population was significant. The image of a manipulative killer toying with public opinion reinforced the helplessness felt in the East End. Every published word became a spark in the fire of collective fear. In stores, taverns, and workers' lodgings, amplified tales fueled panic. This atmosphere of fear quickly took on unprecedented proportions. The fear, fed by the unknown and gratuitous violence, spread throughout the city. Every new rumor or letter reminded people that the assassin remained at large. Volunteer vigilantes, often organized by merchants, patrolled the night, sometimes without coordination with the police, complicating investigations further. Investigators, overwhelmed with false leads, feared missing crucial evidence. The idea that the killer could write, taunting authorities and the public, added a frightening dimension. The threat became palpable, each letter a presence. Among the many hoaxes, one episode reveals the impact of the case, even among children. An 8-year-old student, author of a letter signed Jack the Ripper, was briefly arrested. The authorities, despite being overwhelmed, took the time to question him. The press reported the incident with surprise, illustrating how much the image of the killer, exaggerated and popularized, had penetrated the collective imagination. The case, though quickly closed, showed that this fear permeated all layers of society. The boundaries between reality and fantasy blurred. The massive influx of mail, serious or not, complicated investigators' work. Hoping to find clues, the police became overwhelmed with writings often imitated or inspired by the first sensationalized letters. Style analysis was not always enough to unmask imposters, and the scientific limitations of the time made expert assessments uncertain. The persistent worry maintained a vicious circle. Fear generated new letters which reinforced anxiety. For the first time, a serial killer seemed to be communicating with society at large through the press. This novelty, made possible by advances in communication, was as fascinating as it was worrying. Authorities hoped that an authentic letter might one day reveal the truth, but none led to the formal identification of the murderer. The global echo of these writings opened a new era where crime mixed with sensationalism, leaving a significant precedent in criminal history. In the excitement of the investigations of autumn 1888, several names emerge among the suspects that the press and police consider linked to the Whitechapel murders. The first, Montague John Druitt, a former teacher and amateur lawyer born in 1857, attracts attention after his body is discovered in the Thames near Chiswick on December 31, 1888. His death occurs shortly after the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, the last official victim of the killer. Some see this as a sign of insurmountable guilt. The timing of his suicide, coinciding with the end of the crimes, reinforces the suspicions. However, no material evidence links Druitt to the murder scenes, and investigators like Inspector Frederick Aberline remain cautious. A second suspect draws attention: Aaron Kosminski, a Polish barber living in the East End. Coming from a Jewish family that fled the pogroms, he was institutionalized around 1891 for paranoia and erratic behavior. Although his institutionalization is not directly linked to the murders, his mental profile intrigues. Testimonies mention his obsession with cleanliness and his extreme distrust. Without concrete evidence, the press seizes upon his image, caught between fascination and exaggeration. Michael Ostrog, another suspect, is a complex character. Probably of Russian origin, he has a criminal history involving thefts and frauds. His tendency to lie and his time in prison fuel the rumors. But his absence from London during some murders weakens this lead. In a completely different vein, Sir William Gull, Queen Victoria's physician, is implicated in conspiracy theories involving a royal plot. These speculations, lacking proof, are mainly based on unverifiable accounts. A more local suspect emerges under the nickname Leather Apron, John Pizer, a shoemaker working near Whitechapel. He often wears a leather apron, hence his unsettling reputation. Interrogated by the police, he is quickly exonerated, but his image, widely circulated by the press, fuels the public's fear in search of an identifiable monster. A revealing document of the police perception of the time is the confidential note written around 1894 by Sir Melville Macnaghten. This tier list, later found in the archives, ranks Montague Druitt, Aaron Kosminski, and Michael Ostrog as the main suspects. Although it does not provide any definitive conclusions, it shows the investigators' willingness to refocus their efforts on a few profiles considered credible. In the aftermath of the 1888 crimes, the Metropolitan Police of London is under unprecedented pressure. The public opinion, shocked by the inefficiency of the Whitechapel investigations, demands immediate measures. The penny newspapers and the rise of the telegraph amplify international outrage about the capital of the British Empire. Faced with this threat to the state's credibility, the authorities must respond. Politicians and police officials, aware of the social and economic risks of the scandal, agree on the need to profoundly reform the institution. Even the advocates of order recognize that the police must modernize. The investigation methods deemed outdated must evolve. Significant efforts are then made to ensure both street safety and the image of London as a stable world city, despite Whitechapel. One of the first projects concerns the Criminal Investigation Department, CID, created in 1878. This unit, initiated by Howard Vincent to professionalize investigations, sees its effectiveness questioned after 1888. The Whitechapel affair reveals a lack of trained personnel, the absence of scientific techniques, poor management of crime scenes, and insufficient coordination between services. It becomes urgent to hire new inspectors, diversify skills, and standardize procedures. The hierarchical reorganization is conducted under the authority of Sir Charles Warren, Commissioner until November 1888, then James Monroe. Despite internal tensions, public pressure accelerates decisions. Manuals are written to set protocols, securing scenes, collecting testimonies, examining bodies. The aim is to better circulate information and exploit every clue, even modest ones. The police also begin to become aware of the beginnings of forensic medicine. Although the use of fingerprints or biology is still in its infancy, the importance of carefully preserving physical evidence is understood. Beyond the police, the crimes of Jack the Ripper reveal the misery in certain areas of London. Whitechapel becomes the symbol of urban squalor, a breeding ground for violence. In response, the municipality and several philanthropic associations launch a renovation program. Improving public lighting becomes a priority. Until then, many alleys in the East End were plunged into darkness at night, encouraging crimes. It is decided to install more streetlights, first gas and then electric in the better-off neighborhoods, and to ensure more rigorous maintenance. Even though electric lighting remains marginal in poorer areas, the idea gains traction. Lit streets help reduce assaults, limit nighttime crimes, and facilitate police patrols. Simultaneously, improving workers' housing becomes a social and political priority. The Peabody Trust, founded by the American George Peabody, plays a central role. This philanthropic fund aims to build moderately priced housing while ensuring health and comfort. After 1888, its programs accelerate. Brick buildings, more spacious and equipped with sanitary facilities, are constructed in or near disadvantaged neighborhoods. The authorities support these projects, aware that the crowded conditions of slums are conducive to disease and social tension. Providing decent housing improves quality of life, but also helps reduce crime. The goal is clear: to strengthen public order by addressing the root causes of insecurity. Although the data is approximate, a decrease in assaults and thefts is observed in the newly developed areas. At the same time, the government adopts laws inspired by the trauma of the Whitechapel murders and the fear of further attacks. Hospitals, charities, and religious associations demand better protection for vulnerable women, often homeless or at the mercy of abusive landlords. Women's shelters are created or strengthened by laws regulating emergency accommodation and assistance to victims of violence. Several rescue societies, already active, receive more subsidies, while new structures are established. These institutions temporarily house women fleeing violence or exploitation and offer them basic training, sewing, cooking, maintenance, to aid their reintegration. Meanwhile, public drunkenness becomes a national concern. The accounts of the murders often mention alcoholism in the working class, whether in gin palaces or taverns. Domestic violence, brawls, and alcohol-related delinquency push authorities to restrict access to cheap gin. Public drunkenness legislation, strengthened shortly after 1888, increases fines and expands police powers to arrest dangerously intoxicated individuals. Some courts apply sanctions with caution, fearing to worsen the precariousness of the poorest. Simultaneously, temperance groups, often close to religious circles, call for a night ban on alcohol sales. Although rarely enforced, these demands fuel debates in Parliament and the press. These developments occur in a context where police presence remains a key issue. The modernization of the CID is accompanied by a reorganization of metropolitan police patrols, whose staff increases. To respond to criticisms of a lack of surveillance in the East End alleys, more officers are assigned to sensitive areas, alleys, backyards, and the vicinity of taverns. The goal is to break the sense of impunity and deter criminal acts. The first effects are felt. Arrests for thefts and assaults slightly increase. New recruits receive basic training, including crime scene management and evidence preservation pending the CID. In addition, there are civilian initiatives for surveillance and assistance. From 1891, certain areas of the East End saw the emergence of voluntary women's patrols. The movement, originating from local and informal groups, aimed to secure the streets. Newspaper articles and municipal archives mention women wearing an armband, circulating in pairs at dusk. Unofficial, these patrols quickly gained the respect of residents and, to some extent, the police. Their role was not to pursue criminals, but to assist isolated women and report risky situations. They sometimes intervened directly, guiding a homeless person to a shelter, diffusing an altercation. According to some sources, these initiatives eased tensions and facilitated exchanges between police and locals. The phenomenon of voluntary women's patrols was not limited to the East End. Other major cities in the UK, like Liverpool and Manchester, took an interest, sharing similar living conditions within the working class. Newspapers generally praised the initiative, highlighting the novelty of an organized female presence in the nocturnal public space. This advance was part of a broader movement for women's involvement in public life, supported by suffragettes and charitable associations. While equality remained distant and official recognition of uniformed policewomen was delayed, the symbolic impact of these volunteers was considerable. They demonstrated that a group of women could take concrete action for safety, despite a legislative framework that ignored their actions. Some members of Parliament saw this as a step toward the creation of a female police force. Others feared it would distract from the need to strengthen the Metropolitan Police. These reforms, modernization of the CID, enhanced public lighting, improvement of social housing, laws against drunkenness, support for women's shelters, and voluntary women's patrols, represented a questioning of the Victorian order. The year 1888 acted as a trigger, revealing the system's flaws. London, concerned with preserving its prestige, sought to show that the events in Whitechapel had concrete consequences. While the perpetrator of the crimes eluded the police, they benefited from increased means, while civil society organized to protect the most vulnerable. The first effects were visible in statistics, decreased panic, and more visible surveillance, although social tensions persisted. In philanthropic clubs and political salons, debates occurred on the future of charitable structures and the cooperation between police and community organizations. The Peabody Trust became a model for municipalities wishing to renovate their poor neighborhoods. While public lighting progressed slowly, the need to address the social causes of crime was acknowledged. Reformers believed that a decently housed population, better educated and less prone to alcoholism, represented the best defense against violence. Municipal budgets dedicated to housing and crime prevention increased, albeit unevenly, according to political priorities. CID inspectors, more experienced, recognized the link between poverty and crime, realizing that repression alone would not suffice to curb a multifaceted and entrenched delinquency. Among the most notable developments, women's shelters imposed themselves, despite conservative criticism denouncing the use of public funds. Philanthropic arguments prevailed, especially in the face of the threat of a new cycle of violence. In the East End, These shelters multiplied in the late 1880s. They were supported by Protestant Catholic missions and sometimes even synagogues. This inter-community solidarity, although fragile, showed that the events of Whitechapel had promoted collective action, transcending some religious and social barriers. The leaders of these shelters, often from the bourgeoisie or nobility, became public figures, illustrating the evolving role of women in the social sphere. Fighting public drunkenness remains difficult to assess in the long term. Drinking establishments remain numerous, as alcohol offers an outlet in a challenging working-class daily life. Nonetheless, certain laws encourage taverns to limit the sale of strong alcohol or to refuse service to drunk customers. The first awareness campaigns, led by temperance groups, distribute leaflets and messages about the economic and familial dangers of alcohol. Some police reports indicate a decline in troubles related to drunkenness after the adoption of stricter measures, but this data remains fragmentary. Alcohol consumption persists as an escape from poverty. Sobriety patrols, made up of volunteers, try to deter men from squandering their income and guide the most destitute towards charitable aid. Gradually, fighting drunkenness is seen as a social responsibility, not just a matter of public order. The women involved in the voluntary patrols, which emerged after 1891, do more than mediation in the street. They embody a new form of female solidarity, aiding those facing distress or violence, notably domestic. Accounts from the period describe small groups walking the streets at sensitive times, monitoring arguments and pub exits to intervene at the first signs of aggression. Although unofficial and unsworn, they sometimes form informal ties with police officers who welcome any initiative that soothes nighttime tensions. A look, a few words, can be enough to diffuse a critical situation. Influential figures like Josephine Butler closely follow this dynamic, seeing it as a sign that the city, marked by the events of 1888, now refuses to remain passive in the face of violence against women and the most vulnerable. In 1891, the press relays several poignant stories. Women rescued outside a pub, safely escorted or taken to a shelter. These accounts evoke both empathy and irony, with some mocking a supposed brigade of secular nuns. Yet their effectiveness, confirmed by charitable associations, testifies to a real need. The police stations in Whitechapel and other neighborhoods sometimes end up tolerating, or even quietly encouraging, these volunteers. Spontaneous partnerships form. Trust builds between police and regular patrollers. Without challenging the dominant male authority, these collaborations show that security, too, is becoming a collective responsibility, beyond the strict framework of public force. In 1903, Inspector Frederick Aberline, who had closely followed the Jack the Ripper case, publishes a series of notes known as Aberline's Memoir. He details the investigation, abandoned leads, and rumors of Masonic involvement. Popularized by tabloids fond of conspiracies, this hypothesis suggests influential figures protected the killer to hide secrets. Aberline mentions them cautiously without proof, but the idea of an elitist conspiracy fascinates even decades later. In 1907, a British filmmaker draws inspiration from the myth to produce Silent Ripper, a silent film considered the first slasher. Screened in a few theaters in London and Manchester, the film depicts the hunt for a nocturnal killer, playing with shadows and intertitles. Though few copies survive, it reflects the lasting impact of the case on popular culture. In the wake of this, medical authorities seized the opportunity to promote a new venereal code governing the prevention of sexually transmitted diseases. London, Paris, or Berlin debate over the best way to contain syphilis, gonorrhea, or other infections. The Ripper's modus operandi, targeting prostitutes, reignites discussions on hygiene and public health, fueling a broad movement for social reform. Curiously enough, Winston Churchill, a young journalist, takes an interest as early as 1899 in a series of assaults in Glasgow, reminiscent of a Jack the Ripper imitator. He writes several articles dramatizing the threat. While the investigation concludes with a lone attacker, his correspondence reveals the collective psychosis then prevailing. Over time, Ripperology has structured itself into an informal discipline. Historians, enthusiasts, or former police officers sift through public archives, cross-referencing birth and death certificates and forgotten testimonies. The rise of DNA analysis in the 20th century becomes central to the quest to identify the killer. The early attempts in the 1990s give way to more reliable methods, fueling new theories. In 2007, a collector claims to possess a shawl that belonged to Catherine Eddowes. The fabric, passed down through generations, reportedly still contains DNA traces. In 2014, a partial sequencing is announced, sparking worldwide excitement. Some hail this as a major breakthrough, while others warn of contamination risks after more than a century of handling. In 2019, a study suggests that Aaron Kosminski, a barber institutionalized from 1891, shows a mitochondrial DNA match with the sample. Comparison with his descendants would strengthen the case for his guilt. Despite the enthusiasm, many researchers point out that this type of DNA, less precise than nuclear DNA, is not sufficient to establish definitive proof. In 2025, a British institute resumes analyses with next-generation sequencers. Thanks to forensic genealogy used in unsolved cases in the United States, a family tree is reconstructed from the DNA extracted from the shawl. The results, reported by several media outlets, once again point to Kosminski as the main suspect. However, scientists remind us that the multiple manipulations of the fabric can distort the conclusions. A few months after this revelation, an amateur researcher from Hammersmith claims to have found an unpublished diary at a flea market in Portobello. Dated from the late 1880s, this document gathers testimonies from 4 witnesses ignored by the official investigation, including details about a suspicious individual seen near Mitre Square on the night of Catherine Eddowes' murder. Preliminary examinations confirm the authenticity of the handwriting, sparking interest from academics for further analysis. This discovery also revives old speculations about the involvement of Freemasonry in the case. Some Ripperologists see esoteric symbols and references to Masonic rituals shared on forums and conferences, fueling the idea of a conspiracy. Other researchers remain cautious, highlighting the often speculative nature of these interpretations, especially concerning certain architectural clues or cryptic signatures. The debate remains lively, demonstrating the enduring fascination with this mystery. Meanwhile, the global success of documentaries about Jack the Ripper prompts platforms and filmmakers to produce new programs combining historical reenactments and interviews, maintaining public interest. Fans debate online, comparing their analyses with those of self-proclaimed experts. This continuous media coverage, initiated as early as the 19th century by the sensationalist press, helps to forge the legend of the killer, now an international phenomenon. Today, criminologists use advanced profiling methods to try to understand the killer's psychology. Beyond the mutilations and locations of the crimes, they also analyze social and economic factors that might have influenced his behavior. Some draw parallels with other serial killers from the late 19th century. Although speculative, these studies provide new insights into violence rooted in marginalization and urban poverty, enriching the overall understanding of the phenomenon. The use of forensic genealogy, however, raises ethical debates. While some see it as a legitimate advancement to solve old cases and rehabilitate forgotten victims, others fear an invasion of privacy and potential abuses related to the mass exploitation of genetic data. Nonetheless, this method has already helped identify serial killers and remains at the heart of the controversies surrounding the case. The digitization of archives is also changing the game for amateur investigators. Psychiatric records and press clippings, once difficult to access, are now available online, allowing for a better reconstruction of suspects' paths, like Aaron Kosminski, and highlighting contradictions in certain testimonies. These tools facilitate a more detailed analysis of the social context of Whitechapel, notably revealing long-hidden domestic violence or xenophobic tensions. Finally, with technical advancements, some experts hope one day to extract intact nuclear DNA from objects related to crime scenes, offering more reliable identification than mitochondrial DNA. Interdisciplinary projects, bringing together geneticists, historians, and archivists, are being developed to achieve this goal. The case, without an official verdict since 1888, continues to fuel a multitude of hypotheses, remaining one of the most famous and mysterious criminal investigations in history.